All right, let's take a look at chapter 16. There are two really important parts to this chapter that you need to be aware of. Essentially, what the chapter is doing is showing you two competing governmental systems that are developing in Europe. One is absolute monarchy. There are several examples of that in the chapter. We're going to focus on one, but you need to be aware of all the other ones as well. And we'll kind of go through them as we look at the PowerPoint as well. And the competing system that develops in England, which is constitutional monarchy. So essentially, what you have in this chapter is the difference between two major governmental systems. One that develops in most of Europe, which is absolute monarchy, where you give the monarch complete and utter total control over the government. One person controls everything. And constitutional monarchy, which develops in England, which is limited monarchy. There is something that limits the power of the monarch. So let's take a look at these two systems real quick. Okay? The best example of absolute monarchy is what happens in France. This does not happen overnight. The French don't wake up one day and roll over and say, "Ooh, let's put in a..." No, it doesn't happen that way. It's a long process. It actually goes back maybe even until the late 1500s, early 1600s. So it doesn't happen overnight. Essentially, you got to remember that if you're giving a king total, complete power, someone has to lose power. And in this case, it is the nobility. You take away power from the nobles too fast, then they perhaps revolt. So this system has to evolve a little bit, but it reaches its height under Louis XIV, who is our best example of what an absolute monarch is. Louis believes that he is a divine right monarch, is another concept you need to be aware of, where a king believes that God placed him on earth to rule. So that's the part of divine right, that it comes from a divine source, God, and that king has the right to rule because it was given to him by God. For you, if you're a subject, that means that if you question the king, you're questioning God. So tying religious belief to political power is one of the ways that absolute monarchs are going to increase their power. Louis will build, well, it actually began before Louis's reign, but Versailles, Louis's palace, is a symbol of his authority. The Louis will bring in images of the sun and of Apollo to reinforce this idea that Louis is a powerful king. In some ways, it's very difficult. Louis can't do this because of the power of Christianity, but you're hearkening back to the old days when kings were associated with the gods. So questioning the leader meant questioning the god. So Louis is extremely powerful because of that. When you start talking about absolute monarchy, you're giving power to do lots of things to one person. There is no one else that can question the power of the king. This means that the king has control over foreign policy, the king has control over domestic policy, over taxation, over the way the money is spent. So this is an enormous amount of power put into the hands of one person. The best example I can give you is that during Louis's reign, France will fight essentially four major wars: two with the Dutch, one the War of the League of Augsburg, and then the War of Spanish Succession, which is one of Louis's last wars. It happens and is concluded shortly before he dies. The Of those four, France really doesn't do very well in three of them, and essentially ties the fourth, maybe. But the Louis, in many ways, made sure that these wars were a part of his own sort of personal agenda. None of these wars Louis was attacked. Okay. So Louis made sure that he could use warfare as a tool of his rule. He will create a professional army. Taxes will go towards maintaining that army. Louis really creates an army that is a part of the state. Before this, back during feudalism, armies were a tie to the personal landowners, to the feudal lords. The That kind of goes by the wayfare, and now Louis creates a professional army, one that is paid by the state, one that he appoints most of the upper level officers, and therefore they are loyal to him. If you look at the economic side of things, Louis entrusts most of the French economy to Colbert, who is a big fan of mercantilism. Mercantilism is this economic idea that states need to become self-sufficient. They need a favorable balance of trade. They need to export more than they import. They need colonies to give them raw materials. And so when you put all that together, you understand that what Colbert is trying to do is to make France self-sufficient. France needs colonies, which it gets here in America and in other places as well. And that's going to help the French economy. Colbert is not a big fan of warfare, however, because it disrupts the economic situation. So he'll never be a tremendous fan of all of this warfare that Louis was a part of. The When you see Louis in action, remember that, and as you read this, remember that his goal is to make France stronger. He believes that he has all of this power, and the purpose of his reign is to strengthen the state. So Louis, almost by necessity, when you have all of this power conglomerated in one person, you have the you have one person who becomes the state. In French history, Louis once said that I am the state. In French, it's l'état c'est moi. I am the state. So Louis controlled everything. He strengthened the tax collection. He strengthened the lawmaking abilities. He ran the legal system. He spoke out against the king. There was a good chance you were going to end up in a royal prison controlled by Louis, controlled by the uh, the the king. Louis doesn't do, even though he is so strong, he does make several mistakes. He doesn't do everything correctly. One of the biggest problems that we kind of focus on in Louis's reign is that he will revoke the Edict of Nantes that had been around ever since the reign of Henry IV. The Edict of Nantes had granted some religious toleration to French Protestants. But in 1685, Louis will revoke that and will thus open up French Protestants to persecution. So you got to kind of, this is a terrible idea in a lot of ways because it opens up France to more religious problems, which really France doesn't need. The It takes away from perhaps Louis's effort to unify the state. But you got to kind of admit that Louis is very successful in unifying a tremendous amount of power. So as you read about Louis, always keep that in the back of your mind about how Louis is consolidating power. What are the things that he is doing? How is he taking power away from certain people? How is he gaining power in certain areas? Now, the rest of this first part of the chapter is all about the people, the rest of Europe, really, who wants to or who want to follow Louis's example. If you were a king in the rest of Europe, you would want to follow Louis's example. So we kind of take a tour of Europe here to talk about some of the other major powers that are becoming absolute monarchs. One is in Austria. The Habsburg royal family will bring Austria really into an absolute monarchy. So you'll see Leopold and other Austrian Habsburgs do that through warfare, through fighting their neighbors, regaining certain parts of Europe, fighting with Turkey. For example, the Austrian monarchy becomes very, very absolute as you go through these different monarchs. So make sure that as you read this, all right, that you sort of remember that they're following the same pattern. They're trying to grow in power as well. When you get to Prussia, you learn about really the beginnings of Germany, modern Germany. Prussia will be the unifier of Germany eventually. Now, that doesn't happen for over another century, but we're getting there. Germany is a conglomeration of independent states. The probably over about 300 right at this particular moment. One of them is Prussia. Prussia doesn't really have any good natural borders. And so the solution for Prussia to become a major power was through its army. And Prussia will develop one of the most powerful, the most modern, the most efficient militaries in all of Europe. And it will be the key to them becoming very powerful. So as you read about Prussia, then you find out that under Frederick William I, for example, you have the army becoming almost central to the rise of Prussia. One contemporary once remarked about Frederick William's Prussia that Prussia is not a state that possesses an army, but it is an army that possesses a state. Everything, the army was almost central to Prussia's success and the power of the monarch as well. When you get to Frederick II, Frederick the Great, you get one of our first, maybe something we'll talk about later on, enlightened absolute monarchs or enlightened despots. Frederick was a product of the Enlightenment. He was very artistic. He was very musical, but was also a very good ruler and will use a lot of his power to benefit the people of Prussia. But Prussia is a powerful state, and Frederick William I, Frederick the Great, all of these guys had a tremendous amount of power. The absolute monarchy section of this first part of the chapter finishes up with Russia and talking about Peter the Great. Peter the Great is responsible for modernizing and westernizing Russia through something that historians call the Petrine Revolution, Peter's Revolution. Peter secretly takes a tour of Europe, looks at what other monarchs are doing, borrows from their ideas, brings them back to Russia, and really drags Russia kicking and screaming into the modern age. Russia is always and has always been behind the rest of Europe. And so Peter's solution was to modernize and westernize Russia. He forced the nobles to begin to dress more modernly. He cut off their beards, which was a sign really of their power. He goes to war to regain Russian territory. He will create a professional army. Where does he get that idea from? And he makes Russia more modern. So as you read about Peter, okay, and then into Catherine the Great later on, remember they are all following this pattern of making themselves more powerful. All right, we're going to stop here. I'm going to stop this video, and then we're going to come back and I'm going to talk about constitutional monarchy in a separate video.